I hand over to my colleague William Blecker. The floor for the further proceedings is you.
Thank you so much, Francois. So I think maybe before we get into the discussion, before we start talking about Deborah Vogel, I will hand over to Alessia to just introduce the Institute, which is obviously one of the partners in organising this event tonight.
Thank you, Francois. Thank you, Uilleam. So my name is Alessia and I'm director of the Ukrainian Institute London. It's such a joy to work on this event together in collaboration with the Institute for Polish Jewish Studies and UCL Institute of Jewish Studies. Tonight's event is part of our wider season of events that we call the Many Faces of Ukraine, where the Institute celebrates the multicultural heritage of Ukraine. So keep an eye for other events within this season. And I'm really looking forward to tonight's discussion.
Okay, thank you so much, Alessia. So I'm really delighted to be able to chair this discussion this evening on Deborah Vogel, who is a writer whose name I heard quite a long time ago, probably about 15 years ago or so, or even more, when I was first encountering the works of Bruno Schulz. And I think for many people, this was also the first time they encountered the name of Deborah Vogel, was on the margins of scholarship about Bruno Schulz, as someone associated with him and with his personal life and with his professional career as a writer also. And only many years later, maybe about 3-4 years ago, I came across her again as a poet. And I came across her actually in Ukrainian translation. So her work translated into Ukrainian by a very talented Ukrainian translator called Yurko Prochasko, who works mainly from German, but also took an interest in Deborah Vogel as a writer from his city, from Lviv, and worked with the Yiddish originals and translated her into Ukrainian. And it was she was also, I found out, available in Polish translation, and there was a fair number of really good quality Polish translations, and of course her own original work in the Polish language, as she wrote in 2 languages, but very little available in English, which has been for me sort of frustrating, as I include her in a course that I teach at UCL, but there are so few English translations for students without the languages. But that situation has thankfully changed thanks to this book, Blooming Spaces, the collected poetry, prose, critical writing and letters of Deborah Vogel, which is translated, edited and introduced by Anastasiya Lyubas, our guest this evening. So I'm really delighted that this book has appeared. I think it's a wonderful thing, and it's a really quite comprehensive book covering a whole range of Vogel's work, showing just how kind of diverse and active and dynamic she was as a writer, as a poet, a prose writer, a critic, a philosopher, also a translator herself. So a really multi-talented figure with many dimensions to her work, and a really key and very sadly neglected figure of the sort of interwar avant-garde literary and intellectual scene in Poland, and obviously someone who is associated very closely with the city of Lviv today in Ukraine. So I want to start off by discussing the book and the kind of where the book came from. Anastasiya, if you could tell us maybe a little bit about how you encountered Deborah Vogel's work, why you decided to dedicate yourself to this project, to this what must have been a very sort of lengthy and intense project, and what you think the readers, the modern reader of Deborah Vogel in English will gain. What will appeal to the reader of this book?
Thank you so much, William. And before I start, I'd just like to extend my thanks to Francois and UCL Institute for Jewish Studies, as well as Institute for Polish Jewish Studies and the Ukrainian Institute London for co-sponsoring this event. So similar to your encounter with Vogel, and I think that is probably a very typical encounter with the texts, sadly, of female authors, I did find her as a footnote to Bruno Schulz's work. And she was introduced, I can actually share my screen, and you can see two portraits by, can you see my screen? So these are two portraits by a Canadian-based artist, Baroness Eisenstein, who made portraits of Bruno Schulz and Deborah Vogel for her collection called Correspondences. So I was reading up Jerzy Ficowski's work on Bruno Schulz, where Deborah Vogel was introduced as an author of a single book of a Polish collection, Akacja Kwitną, Acacia's Bloom in English. And this is how I encountered this author. And I was immediately intrigued to learn a little bit more about her, and went on to research some other works that have been written about her. So on the next slide, you can actually see the book that I read by a researcher based in Wrocław, Karolina Szymaniak, who's a pioneer in Vogel studies. And she published a monograph under an enigmatic title, To Be an Agent of Eternal Idea, the aesthetic views of Deborah Vogel, back in 2006 in Krakow. And this is the work that first exposed me to not just the writings, since Karolina included certain selections by Vogel in her book, but also the theoretical ideas, the philosophical and intellectual ideas by this author. And I went on to read Vogel's prose, first in Polish, and a little bit later I got to read her work in Yiddish as well, which was not as accessible, which was not as easy to find. I was able to find the original of Akacja Kwitną, so the Polish version, which was actually published a bit later than the Yiddish version. So just looking at that book and reading her prose montage, her experimentation with literary montage struck me as something that was very compelling, very modernist, but also very contemporary. To come back, I guess, to your question as well, and maybe it would be worth introducing Deborah Vogel briefly to those of you who don't know who she is, because she is usually being introduced, or has been usually introduced, as the muse of Bruno Schulz. So I've shown a portrait of Schulz, who was a Polish Jewish author, famous for his collection, The Street of Crocodiles, which actually arose out of the correspondence that he held with Deborah Vogel. And, you know, instead of being his muse or love interest, we might probably think of Vogel as more of a mentor figure to Schulz, who actually encouraged him to publish that collection and actually gain fame. She was herself a poet, a translator, a philosopher, an art critic, and an educator. Born in a Maskilic family in Western Ukraine, in a small town called Bursztyn. It's Western Ukraine now. Obviously, it was Eastern Poland at that time. She lived and spent most of her time in Lviv, or Lviv in Polish, as it was called at that time. And this is actually also my hometown, so hence the interest in Vogel. Very much, somebody who I didn't know about for the longest time, and that struck me as a very visible absence in the landscape, which thankfully that has changed now. So a little bit more about her family and very briefly about her life. So I mentioned that she came from a Maskilic family, a family of proponents of the Jewish Enlightenment, or the Haskalah. She spoke Hebrew at home with her father, as well as Polish. It was an acculturated Jewish family. She corresponded in German with her uncle, who was the chief rabbi of Stockholm, Marcus Ehrenpreis. And she came to Yiddish as an adult. She learned the language a bit later in life, and she began to publish in both Yiddish and continued to publish in Polish. And as a writer, what's important to keep in mind that she was very much somebody who was interested in the transatlantic connections between the European literary milieu and the American one. And she considered herself the ambassador of Yiddish modernism in Poland, translating works of Yiddish modernists based in New York predominantly into Polish, and educating the Polish cultural milieu in Poland about the Yiddish authors that were active in Halachina, or Galicia, her own region. So that was her activity as an author. She tragically perished when she was only 42 years old in a Nazi action in the ghetto with her son, her husband, and her mother. So she didn't enjoy a very long writerly career as many other writers. And I guess to the question of what makes her so compelling today, well, there's a couple of reasons. I would say that you might want to read Deborah Vogel. Scholar from Lund, Sweden, and a dear friend, Dr. Schwartz, mentioned to me that Deborah Vogel was writing as if she was writing for contemporary societies that are multilingual and multicultural. Her sensibility, which was very much a universalist sensibility, trying to balance particular Jewish concerns with universal ambitions, appeals to the modern reader. But I think that it's important to keep in mind that she was very much, and I think by reading this volume, you'll appreciate the fact that she was very much an extremely educated and erudite woman who had a PhD. She obtained a PhD from Jagiellonian University in philosophy in Krakow. A Jewish woman who struggled with gender discrimination, financial difficulties, and multiple barriers, including misogynist criticism, limited readership for her work, especially in Yiddish, even as she continued to uphold her commitments to high art and paved her way as a professional writer in the 1930s. And I think, by reading Vogel's work, you will also discover Poland's and Ukrainian and broadly speaking Eastern European turbulent 20th century, and learn about the lesser known histories of the avant-garde that Uilleam also pointed to, that sadly Vogel has been really marginalized in many ways, even though she should be taking a more central position in that history of the Polish avant-garde, the Jewish and the Yiddish avant-garde, and broadly the European vanguard as well. I would also say that some other reasons that make her compelling today have to do with these, more universalist sensibilities that I mentioned in the beginning. So I think that Deborah Vogel has a way of showing an individual in her connections to technologies, mass culture, economy, and politics, which I think is very contemporary. So her poetic and her literary method is about showing happenings that are usually foregrounded as significant, for instance, wars or unemployment or revolution or any type of momentous events. And you can think pandemic here as well. These events, these significant events in her work mingle with everyday events, which are usually not foregrounded, which are considered less significant, which are considered banal. And she really abolishes the hierarchy between the two by, letting the reader experience the boredom and the monotony of finding oneself in enclosed spaces, experiencing repeatable gestures and movements, which I think is very relatable to us, going to a single destination and returning to that destination, the banality of repeatable modes of having a conversation, and also the repeatable type of labor, which is often also very gendered. So these are some of the things that I think make her truly compelling for a contemporary audience as well.
Thank you so much. That was such a wonderful introduction to Deborah Vogel. And I think if anybody was not convinced that they need to read her before that, they will be now. But I want to come back to something you mentioned a few times there, which was the language. So Deborah Vogel wrote in Yiddish and also in Polish, but as you said, she was brought up in this and existed in this very multilingual environment where Yiddish and Polish coexist with Ukrainian, and also German language was an important part of her own world, and also Hebrew, I guess. So there's lots of languages in play and kind of informing her background, her intellectual, her cultural, her social background. And she chooses to write first in Polish, which I guess is the kind of the literary language of the society in which and the state in which she's living, but also in Yiddish, which is in some ways, as you alluded to, a kind of almost a surprising choice, or a courageous choice, I suppose, for someone who came to it as a literary language as an adult. Maybe it wasn't the most natural language for her to write in, not the easiest for her to write in. So I wondered if you could tell us something about that choice. What made her choose that language, and also what was the kind of literary environment that she was entering, the Yiddish literary environment that she was entering? Because you mentioned also that this was not something just confined to Poland. It was also a literature that went into Europe and even to North America as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So sadly, we don't have Vogel's personal account of why she chose Yiddish. We have references to that here and there in her writings, but we have an account from her friend, who was a writer and a journalist in her own right, Rachel Auerbach, or Rochel Auerbach in Yiddish. That name might be familiar if you're interested in the history of the Shoah. She was one of the writers, important figures in the Ohenek Shabbos in Poland. So she was Vogel's university friend. They they attended Jewish Society in Jan Kazimierz University in Lviv. They studied philosophy together. So she was somebody who very much knew Vogel from her youth and later on. And Auerbach was an important figure because she herself was a staunch Yiddishist or Yiddishistka, as she called herself. And she tried to convince multiple other Jewish authors to begin to write in Yiddish instead of choosing, the road of a Polish writer, for instance. She was talking to Bruno Schulz as well. We know this, did not succeed to convert him into Yiddishism. But she did, at least as she claims, with Deborah Vogel. So she published a memoir, and that memoir came out in an important Israeli journal dedicated to Yiddish culture and Yiddish literature called Die Goldene Kate. And that memoir was called Nicht ausgesponnene Feder, Unspun Threads. And in that memoir, she talks about Deborah Vogel's choice to write in Yiddish, in which she played an important part, as she claims. And she also discusses the literary milieu of which she and Vogel were a part, the journal, the Yiddish Literary and Cultural Journal, Zusteier, which they co-edited and to which they contributed, as well as Vogel's relationship to Bruno Schulz. So while the linguistic choice is not the main component of this memoir, of this exercise that Auerbach is doing post-Shoah and trying to really memorialize her friend and also the milieu of Yiddish writers pre-war in her hometown. She does tell us that she helped Vogel with her first trials in trying to craft this extremely avant-garde experimental poetry in Yiddish, that she really served as the first editor to her work in Yiddish. And we know that Vogel really began to write her poetry in German, actually. So she didn't write it in Polish or in Hebrew, but she did write her first attempts at this experimental poetry were actually in German. And she talks about that in her letters to Marcus Ehrenpreis, her uncle and the chief rabbi of Stockholm, trying to get his advice on some linguistic matters and publication matters of where this work might possibly find a home. She didn't see opportunities to publish in Poland. She believed that that work would not be as accepted there, and she was looking to publish elsewhere, potentially in a German-speaking country. And it was not as strange that she turned to Marcus Ehrenpreis, who himself hailed from Lviv, hailed from Lemberg, and traveled quite a bit in Europe before being in Stockholm. He was also a rabbi in Sofia in Bulgaria. And he was somebody who was an impeccable stylist in both Yiddish and Hebrew, in both Jewish languages and literatures. And that's something that an important Yiddish critic, Shmuel Niger, mentions in his book, The Bilingualism of Jewish Literature. So he actually mentions Marcus Ehrenpreis as a very rare good stylist in both languages. He was also a great writer in Swedish. So he definitely knew a thing or two about writing in languages that were not one's native tongue. So, Vogel earlier turned to him about her language choice. And later we know she did she did start writing and publishing mostly her poetry in Yiddish. I do want to say that she didn't completely switch to just Yiddish, with her prose being bilingual, as I mentioned before. There is a Polish version of her prose montage and a Yiddish version, even though they are not identical, and they are an interesting case of self-translation. And she also continued to publish critical work in both Yiddish and in Polish. And the reasons for that are probably multiple. She was trying to appeal to different audiences, and for certain types of works, I think she saw more opportunities to appeal to a wider audience through publishing in Polish. Her choice of what to publish in which language is also interesting. So she was publishing some essays that related to things like racism and anti-Semitism in Polish. And for instance, she published other essays about Yiddish literature in a wider context, in a wider European context in Yiddish. So we see that she was very much feeling like she was an ambassador to different audiences.
Thank you so much. So I guess we've heard a bit about Yiddish, we've heard about Deborah Vogel's poetry, so maybe we should actually hear some of those, hear the language and hear the poetry. And I believe you have a poem ready for us and I think we're going to have it in 3 versions, is that right?
Yes. So I'm going to read her poem, which is called, apologies to go through this. It's called Day Figure, and it's from her first collection of Yiddish poetry that she published in 1930. And before I read this poem, I just want to mention that a Yiddish critic and poet in New York, Arne Glantz Lyubas, who was part of the high modernist movement of Yiddish poetry in New York, mentioned that this collection made him think that Lviv was not too far from New York. What struck him was originality and the freshness of the style of Deborah Vogel's work. So I'm going to read the English translation first, and then the Yiddish, as well as the Ukrainian translation, which Uilleam, I believe, was the first language that you read Deborah Vogel in, right? Okay, so Day Figure. A gray rectangle, a second, a third. 7 times the tin rectangle opens. Yellow sun, red sun, on one side, on another. The day rectangle has closed. Gray tin birds hover, lumps of soft dough with 2 hands and 2 feet roll in the gray clay of light. 4 times a day. Yellow sun on one side of the rectangle, on the other. A first, months of stiff tin flowers. A second, a third, months of sticky tin flowers, hens and clothes. How many times it has opened, how many times closed. The tin rectangle with the yellow sun circle on both sides. This is the Yiddish version. I'm going to read it to you as well. So it's called Togfigur. A groer rechteck, a zweiter, a dritter. 7-mal effen sich der Blech rechteck. Gelle Sonn, rote Sonn. Von ein Seit, von der zweiter Seit. A Tog rechteck hat sich geschlossen. Grohe Vögel von Blech schwimmen. Kletzer von weichem Teig mit 2 Händen und 2 Fies. Keikeln sich in grohen Leim von Licht. 4-mal am Tag. Gelle Sonn von ein Seit rechteck, von der zweiter. An erster Heudisch von steif blecherne Blumen, der zweiter, der dritter Heudisch, von klebig blecherne Blumen, Hemd und Kleider. Wieviel Mal schon hat sich aufgetun, wieviel Mal sich geschlossen, der blecherne Rechte, mit dem gelben Sonnenkreisel von 2 Seiten. And the Ukrainian translation, which I don't have the slide for, but I'll read it for you, is by Юрко Прохасько. Фігура дня. Сірий прямокутник. Другий. Третій. 7 разів відкривається пляшаний прямокутник. Жовте сонце, червоне сонце. З одного боку, з другого боку. Прямокутник дня зімкнувся. Сірі птахи із бляхи пливуть. Кльоцки пухкого тіста з 2 руками і 2 ногами катуляються в сірій глині світла 4 рази на день. Жовте сонце з одного боку прямокутника, з другого. Перший місяць жорстких бляшаних квітів, другий, третій місяць липко-бляшаних квітів, рук і одежі. Скільки разів уже відчинявся, скільки ж разів зачинявся бляшаний прямокутник жовтим сонячним колом з обидвох боків.
Thank you so much for reading so beautifully in 3 languages. That's wonderful. And I can see we've got some applause appearing, virtual applause appearing on the screen. But really, really wonderful, I think, for us just to hear, what Deborah Vogel's poetic voice sounded like. And I think that one, it's a very, very characteristic poem for her, characteristic of her style. And I was interested to see the images that you chose. I think very, very appropriate and images for her style. And you mentioned also previously her kind of interest in montage techniques. And there is certainly something very visual about her poems. I think she was interested in art. She wrote about art. She thought about visual arts. She was influenced by visual art and kind of photography and film and all these kind of very modernist, very avant-garde things. So I wonder maybe just as a comment on the poem that we've just heard, if you could say a little bit about those ideas and those kind of aesthetic ideas that she's bringing in.
Mm-hmm. So this example that I just read, and very much along the lines of what you just mentioned, William, is an example of a cubist style in poetry, which is very rare to come by in Yiddish. I will attribute the idea to Asya Gefter, who actually said that Gertrude Stein could be considered, Deborah Vogel could be considered the Gertrude Stein of the interwar Poland. Because obviously, it's a very different type of style from Gertrude Stein's type of work, but there are definitely some similarities in trying to work with this visual imagery and incorporate the visual language of lines, geometrical figures, as well as pair it with some affects, boredom, monotony. So this is very much what's at work in Vogel's earliest collection of poetry. She moves a little bit away from that, and constructivism too. I have to mention that she was definitely influenced by the Polish constructivism and the Russian constructivism and sort of working with the materiality. So interest to materiality, as well as a certain performativity and theatricality was very much at the core of what she was doing. You also mentioned Montage. She took keen interest in photomontage, which was very widespread at the time it was to be found in both, journalistic publications and your newspapers, even advertisements, where, in the matter of montage, as well as obviously artistic production. She wrote a seminal essay in Polish, which was called Genealogia Fotomontażu, Genealogy of Photomontage, and published it in 1934. And there she quotes one of the important figures for Polish constructivism, Mieczysław Szczuka, as well as some artists from the movement in Lviv, which united both Polish, Jewish, and Ukrainian artists. So it was called Artes. So such names as Henryk Streng, later known as Marek Włodarski. There's actually an excellent exhibition in Warsaw right now dedicated to Henryk Streng's work. As well as other artists, Margit Reich-Selska, Otto Hahn, and others that worked with photomontage at that time, and who were very much influenced by the filmic experimentation with the technique of montage. And this is very much what Vogel was interested in for her prose, in trying to take that experimentation with the montage technique from the filmic medium and from the photographic medium and transpose it into the literary realm. So we see very much an interest in the visual culture. And, if you think about it, the 20s and the 30s of the 20th century are really a time of the visual culture, and trying to reconcile the developments of the visual culture with the longer existing, or perhaps not longer existing, but more established print culture and literary culture. And I think, we see her interest in visuality in both her poetry and her prose, trying to really go in step with the times, with the developments in the visual medium, and transpose that to the literary medium, and make Yiddish literature really a part of the European vanguard. I think that was at stake in her work.
Yeah, it's this wonderful kind of intermedial aspect of her work. It's really fascinating. I think, speaking of this, you mentioned this artistic milieu of Lviv between the wars and all the interesting artists that were working there. I think maybe this is a good moment for me to bring Irina Starvoit into the conversation. Iryna, I know that this is something that you are interested in, the modernist Lviv, avant-garde Lviv, and kind of bringing it into the consciousness of contemporary Ukrainians, contemporary Lvivians. I wonder if you could just maybe tell us something about Lviv as a city of modernism, a city of the avant-garde, Deborah Vogel's place within that, maybe her relationship to the other literatures, cultures existing in that same environment, the Polish, the Ukrainian.
Thank you so much. So if we come to the question, who was Deborah Vogel in Lviv and in eastern part of Poland and in Galicia of that particular period, the first half of 20th century, of course, she was a kind of a singing muse. It was mentioned already that she has been known to some of you or to many of you as a footnote to Bruno Schulz's work. But in a way, Bruno Schulz himself was only a footnote at certain point to letters which he wrote to a younger Deborah Vogel. So for many people in 1920s, she herself represented a very particular kind of a modern woman, emancipated woman and intellectual woman of the time. I think that when we talk about Deborah, we can use this metaphor of perfect imperfection. You have been asking yourself what would ring the bell, what would be somehow in tune with today's crossroads in history, and what is akin of our sensitivity. So a lot of things are very much akin because Deborah lived through a very turbulent time in very complex societies. First of all, as a young girl, she experienced First World War. It is rarely mentioned in her biographies that she was part of this human tragedy of a global scale of the time, and that actually in Lviv of the time, two important things has happened. By the end of the war, Austrian-Hungary ceased to exist. The fatherland, the place where she was born, actually dissolved and disappeared in the air. But more than that, there was a kind of trauma in the city of Lviv, in this particular region between Przemysl and Lviv. There was a war, a Polish-Ukrainian war, for who will dominate this particular land and this particular chunk of the future national entity. So on the ruins of former empire, nation states were appearing one by one, mushrooming states, and it was third and felt as very unfair that like Czech and Slovak won their own state, Hungary created its own state, and Poland was successful in that. And even Ukraine later as a Soviet republic was successful in that. But this Western Ukrainian or Eastern Poland part was still unresolved. It is not mentioned enough that in the beginning of November 1918, when Deborah with her family was already back to Lviv, back to the city of her residence, there was a huge pogrom in Lviv, which was made as a revenge or some odplata by Polish deserters from Austrian-Hungarian army and by Polish military against Jewish population of the city. And it was a huge international scandal, and there was a special committee appointed by US President at the time, Woodrow Wilson, to make a report on what was the case, what exactly has happened in that damned city of Lviv. And the resolution of that was quite pitiful, that it is not the Polish government who is to blame. Of course, it was a lawless situation, but unfortunately, the constellation of communities is so complex, and they are so much at odds with each other that Jewish, Polish, and Ukrainian community would not probably live in peace for the next decades. So it's very dark scenario, and we don't know what exactly will happen later. This prediction actually was prophetic, and we have to take in mind also that Deborah had to define for herself what is her political stance, what is her social stance as well, not only her intellectual and artistic stance when she was maturing as a young philosopher and writer. So we know for sure that she was one of the most educated females of the time. And we also know for sure that her choice of creative language, Mameloshin, Yiddish as the mother tongue, was not easy, especially not easy at her own family. Her own family was rather on the Zionist side. And to choose Yiddish as a language of her creativity was to go in the competing direction, let's say. And she was part of the Enlightenment movement, which was very sensitive to the lower classes of society, though she herself represented rather middle class or upper middle class. And I think her perfect imperfection was also in that case that she had to make very bold choices between three major notions, between three major ideas she has to live through as a creative and living experience. First, what does it mean to be modernist in the situation like Poland as we call it now, interwar period? At that time they call it post-war period. It was intellectual, high modernist lady who actually was living rather in the province, rather at the outskirts of the most important things which were happening in intellectual capitals and modernist capitals of the time. She was not in Paris, she was not in Berlin, she was not in Kiev or Kharkiv, she was not in Petersburg or Moscow, she was not in Warsaw, as Rachel Auerbach at certain point decided to move there. She was staying in Lviv all the time. The other bold choice was about art, whether the art is to be territory of engagement, including some social and political engagement, or is it l'art pour l'art? Is it so poor as it could be? In her philosophical dissertation, she was examining what has happened to the idea of art since Kant and after Kant. And her own answer to the question would be that we, the generation of 1920s, we have to be engaged in the political agenda as much as we can, because there is no art which is somehow taking place in vacuum. And the third bold decision was about her own identity. And I think this decision was dynamic and had different answers at different stages of her biography. For the first, she almost rejected her female identity as such. She was, in a way, she was, let me return to the screen. She was asking herself about feminism of the time and all kind of emancipatory gestures, eroticism, new sexual revolution which has been taking place in urban life. And she was not very happy with these images of hypersexual woman or woman of new habits and new possibilities. She was calling this misleading emancipation. Together with Rachel Auerbach, they decided that their aim is to reach this level at which women would not be any object of desire or object of consideration, but become an acting subject. And in this way, they reached conclusion that beauty harmed women. Non-beauty allows something more. Non-beauty, along with determination to learn, to develop, and to partake in real life. This is what she was promoting since at least second half of her creative biography. It is important to mention that Meila Haravich, when writing about Deborah Vogel later in Australia, the place of his residence, was saying that every word she pronounced had behind at least 3 books read. And it means 2 things. First, that she was an extraordinary educated woman, sometimes feared for her education. She defended her PhD at Jagiellonian University, and it was probably one of the first female defense ever in philosophy, not only in Jagiellonian, but in the whole region. But at the same time, that she was very constrained with self-expression, that she was hesitating whether she has to write, whether she has to publish what has been written, and whether she has to come up with any critics upon self-defense or in the gesture of self-defense, because she understood that nobody actually understood her, besides probably a close circle of very dear friends. And the third important dimension to what I have already said is that to her books of poetry, Figures of Days, 1930, and Mannequins, 1934, along with her alone book of a short prose, Acacias in Bloom. They all were published early. They were published, let's say, in the first part of her creative biography. And we don't know what was the second part. We don't know exactly, because there are no manuscripts who survived the Holocaust together with along with the family of Baron Bloom and Vogel. Nothing actually remained till our days, so we could not judge what was her development and how her thought and her talent has actually shifted from one level to another. But we can be pretty sure that it was in the development, and we can be pretty sure that there were some novelties to her attitudes towards all three questions about what is high modernism and her place in it, what is engaged art and what is her place in it, and what is female Jewish identity and her place in it.
Okay, thank you so much, Iryna. So many different aspects of Deborah Vogel's work that we could explore, but I'm conscious that we're sort of time is catching up on us. And I did want to remind everybody in the audience that you can ask questions to our speakers about Deborah Vogel, about the book, about anything you'd like to know. And we do actually have one question already from Ursula Phillips, and she's asking, this is in relation to the slide which had a photograph of Zofia Nałkowska. Was Deborah Vogel challenging the views of Zofia Nałkowska? Is that why we have a picture of her here?
Yeah, I can just mention, and it's important to mention that Lviv of the time was a female writer place in many ways. If I only mention a couple of names like Rachel Korn and Irina Wilde and Milena Rudnicka and Rachel Auerbach, Halina Górska, Anna Kowalska, Maria Strutyńska, Olga Duczymińska, Daria Wikonska, all these female writers, they were present at the same time in the same place, and Zofia Nałkowska was visiting and was related to some of them in correspondence. So yes, Zofia Nałkowska was also, I think, one of the few to make a response to a small book of prose published in 1935 by Deborah Vogel, and as Deborah understood that, misunderstood the whole thing. And maybe I also want to quote final word in the discussion about what exactly is her prose about was done by Bruno Schulz. And as far as I understand that, Schulz wanted to defend her originality, because many times she was accused of being like a second-hand or imitative towards Schulz himself. And it is important to mention that Schulz is coining a very important interpretation of her more mature writing, saying that it is petrified tragic world. Many times researchers are somehow in the fog. They are a little bit disoriented with all these tricks and new introduction which were done by contemporaries in visual and cinema arts, and they say that montages actually are about cinematography, but montages are exactly about these new hints, new tricks which are used in the normal visual art, where the dynamics of the city and all kind of flux and flows of the urban, they are considered to be shallow. And the most important and deepest things are those who are petrified. So as a philosopher and as a creative writer, Deborah is looking into the, let's say, hidden side, or somehow in some unmovable substances with which she can work as an artist. And these unmovable substances are getting into these new constellations. But constellations are not puzzles only. The very important event in Lviv, devoted to Deborah Vogel and organized by two fellows, Asya Gefter, who is probably present now, and Olesya Zdorovetska, back in 2016 and 17, they called their very important exhibition devoted to Deborah's legacy, Puzzles of Memory. But here I would say it's not only a puzzle, because when you have a puzzle, it's like you have the general picture and you only have to fill some missing parts, some missing pieces. But with Deborah and her legacy and her generation, we have a riddle rather than a puzzle. We have to be very creative to answer their questions, because we have to be detailed and very subtle in reconstructing the context of their lives and their deaths.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. And speaking of questions, we do have a couple more questions. So I guess maybe two I will take immediately. So question from Irina Marczuk. So this is an interesting question about Deborah Vogel. Was she able to travel, and if so, where? And also from Marek Słomka, did she take an interest in Yiddish movie production in Poland of her time? So I wonder, maybe this would be a moment to come back to Anastasiya. Maybe you'd like to address one or both of these questions.
Sure. So in reference to the first question about her travels, indeed, she did travel quite a bit, not in the 30s, but in the late 20s. She was able to travel to Stockholm to visit her uncle's family, and also in general, she took interest in seeing artistic exhibitions and go on the tour of different museums. So she visited Stockholm and she wrote about it. She wrote a travelogue that she published in Polish about her travels. She also traveled to Paris and Berlin, and this is very much in tune with her interests in modern art. She was looking at the Cubist painting in Paris. She took interest in Dada and in film that was developing in Berlin at that time. And she saw some filmic premieres in the city. We know about that. So that was her stay in the late 20s, right after defending her dissertation. She went on this tour. She was hoping to travel to New York, which didn't quite materialize. Unfortunately, she was corresponding, I mentioned, with Arne Glantz-Lyubas and a couple of other intellectuals in New York who were trying to raise some funds to have her come and lecture in New York. That did not happen. We also know about mentions of travels to Palestine. Iryna mentioned that she came from a Zionist family with Zionist leanings, so connection to Palestine was really important. So that's in terms of her travel. The question from Marek Słomka about the interest in the Yiddish movie production, that's an excellent question, because we do have some great movies in Yiddish at this time. If you think about Green Fields and others, we don't have, at least not to my knowledge, there is no mention of Yiddish filmic production in any of her reviews. I did mention that she reviewed Soviet Ukrainian film. She did write about Jewish artists who were exhibiting, in different exhibitions in her hometown, specifically also in the Jewish Museum in Lviv, but there is no record, at least, of things that she might have written about Yiddish movie production, which doesn't mean that she was not interested in it. It's just that we don't have, any record to say anything definitive about that.
Okay, thank you so much. I can see a couple of hands up. If you don't mind putting your questions into the chat, so we're not going to put people on screen, but we're very, very happy to take the questions in the chat. We did have another question about Yiddish language. I mean, I guess this has been touched on already, but I don't know if Anastasiya, you'd like to add anything. Carol Mann asks, what was the use of the Yiddish language and expression of?
Mm-hmm. It was, she really wanted to propel Yiddish to the vanguard, I think, with her experimental poetry, which she did write exclusively in Yiddish and not in Polish. For some of the essays that she wrote in Yiddish, there is a terrific essay that she wrote on Marc Chagall. It's a two-part essay, a very extensive essay that she published in the Zusteier journal in Lviv. And this is the essay that she actually handed to Marc Chagall when she met him in Paris. And I think for her, Yiddish was an expression of high caliber art criticism as well that she wanted to create in that language.
Thank you so much. And we do have just got another question in about Yiddish. So this is from Jordan Lee Schnee. Perhaps one of the speakers could say a bit more about Vogel's relationship to Yiddish. Did she speak Yiddish in her day-to-day life? Her written Yiddish has comparatively few Hebraic words and Slavicisms. Was this intentional, or was there some kind of German backdrop to her Yiddish? So that's a really interesting.
Yeah, that's an excellent question about her Yiddish. And I think those of you who might have picked up on her diction in De Figure in Yiddish, you could hear that it's, and see, I suppose on the slide, that it's very much Germanized, using, Germanic words instead of Hebraic words in Yiddish. That's both a question of her, I think, being a female author in Yiddish. There's been scholarship written about Yiddish female authors who use significantly less Hebrew words and expressions in Yiddish as opposed to male writers. And I think possibly to an influence, there must have been an influence of the Yiddish in Galicia at that time, which was not the best variant of Yiddish. It was considered more Deutschmirisch, or the Germanized type of Yiddish, and this was the kind of Yiddish that a lot of the writers from the neo-romantic movement of Yiddish authors that preceded Vogel's generation wrote in. But I think, this also might have to do with her intent in writing in Yiddish and really trying to make Yiddish into, this European sounding language of modernist expression, to make Yiddish into something else, still a Jewish language, but perhaps a more universalist language. I think it has to do with some ideas that she was definitely exposed to, of the introspectivist movement in New York, the Enzahisten, who believed that you didn't have to write on overtly Jewish themes as long as you wrote in one of the Jewish languages, in Yiddish, for instance, that counted as, as writing in a Jewish language, so you could write about any sorts of topics. And yes, indeed, she does use very, very few Hebrew expressions, and that's very characteristic of her style. But she also uses a very sparse vocabulary in Yiddish. That's a very deliberate. That's a very deliberate choice that signals some sort of an intellectual, rigorous system of thought that she was trying to follow.
Thank you. So we have a few more really interesting questions. I think probably I will take these questions and then we'll have to bring things to a close because we're running out of time a bit. But so a couple of questions raised. Did Deborah Vogel like Soviet Yiddish literature? That's from Uilleam Radchenko. That's a really interesting question. Was she aware of what's happening in the Soviet Union? Was she reading it? What was her attitude? Also a question about kitsch and kitsch in her work. So there's a reference here, I think, to in White Words by Deborah Vogel. I believe that's a reference to a book that you've also edited in Ukrainian. Could you say a little bit more about her interest in the topic of kitsch? And that also comes up in the introduction to this volume as well. Are there translations of Vogel into German? And the last one, and maybe you can just choose which of these you want to address. Could you elaborate on the relationship between Deborah Vogel's writing and broader European modernism? Maybe she mentioned the author whose writing inspired her, or comes into the dialogue with the other modernist authors. That's from Victoria Punska.
Definitely. I can try to address some of these very quickly. So the first question about translations into German. There's actually an excellent edited volume that was published in 2016. It's called Die Geometrie des Verzichts. So the geometry of resignation or renunciation, and it was edited and translated by Anna Maya Misek. I can later put a link for your reference. So yes, there are translations into German, and what's interesting, this publication includes also bilingual poetry, so in Yiddish and in German, for the reader to follow. So that's an interesting thing about that German volume. So the question of kitsch or schund, as we would say in Yiddish, trash. She was very much interested in that question and in how mass culture could be repurposed for the purposes of the high modernist culture. How you could basically recycle something that's considered kitschy, something that's considered definitely not high art for her purposes. She was in that interest in kitsch and in schund. She was not dissimilar from a lot of the Yiddish writers at that time. Just to give you brief context, there were debates about whether schund literature or popular literature or mass literature, sort of melodramatic novels, what we would call potboilers, are something that are, if that's something that should be worthy of consideration by an educated public. And that was, very fiercely debated by a lot of Yiddish writers. To give you an example, Itzik Munger, a famous Yiddish poet, took his stance on schund. There were debates in different venues and publications like Literarische Blätter, where authors took their positions. So instead of discarding schund completely or kitsch completely, Vogel very much integrated that into her work. And in that, I mentioned, she's similar to both the Yiddish authors that worked within this context of lowbrow literature and middlebrow literature. And she was also similar to the artists that I mentioned from this artist group in Lviv, who were very much interested in the visual culture of the suburbs, where the masses lived, and integrated that into their aesthetic. So, there is a lot to be said about that topic. I think I need to stop now, for the sake of time. Just quickly to address the Soviet literature. Indeed, she was following the developments in the Soviet Union. She does reference, for instance, the work of Leonid Leonov in her essay on the role of progressive intelligentsia. She did, she was interested in the new developments in the Soviet art and specifically in literature. And, she did write a lot about the topic, in that essay, she does address the topic of proletarian art and what that means in addition to her own aesthetic program. So, which I think is something that you would expect of an intellectual at her time, this interest in the developments of the Soviet literature. Her writing's relationship to broader European modernism, I'll just mention that she was exceptionally educated. Her essays, which I chose to foreground in this volume because I think we don't know enough female essayists, and especially, female essayists in Polish and in Yiddish. So that was an intentional editorial decision for myself. She has multiple references in her essays to a lot of writers, intellectuals, visual artists. So she was influenced by the visual arts. I did mention, Cubism, constructivism. I mentioned some Polish constructivists that she took keen interest in. She also traces her own method and puts it at a contrast with the method of surrealists. And, she would talk about what André Breton, for instance, does and how that's different from her own artistic method. She refers to Orphism, all kinds of things. To address that question, I would need a lot more time, but she was very much on top of what was happening in terms of European modernist avant-garde artistic developments.
Thank you so much. So yeah, I think we do have to wrap up pretty much now, but I wondered just if I could ask both of you very, very quickly, and I mean in one sentence, if you could each tell us, I guess, what you think, why should, thinking with my kind of Ukrainianist hat on, and from the Ukrainian point of view, why is Deborah Vogel important for Ukrainians today and people who live in her city in Lviv today?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I could ask Iryna to give us just a very, very, very short answer because we're running out of time, and then I'll come back to Anastasiya for the last word.
Well, I think Deborah spent half of her creative life in Europe and in Poland, which was sliding into fascism. And I think that she was observing populist movements as we do, very much so. And as for a question about Soviet Yiddish culture, I would just mention very important note in response to Yuri Amirachenko question, that she was not fooled by Soviet rule, which came upon her, we can say, home city in 1939. She didn't join Soviet Writers' Union. She didn't benefited from all things which they could bring. And because of that, she also was deprived from the chance to escape the Holocaust, to move and evacuate into the deeper part of the Soviet Union. So because of repressions in the Soviet Union of 1930s, because of short Yiddish renaissance in Soviet Union, she was not interested to cooperate with that power anymore by 1939. So because of that, because many of her moral choices and moral stances, and because of the fact that he was for most of her life part of unwanted society within the bigger society. And that was very complex society, which was at the brink of war all the time, not only in 1939. That's why her observations are so acute. Her sensitivity is so penetrating and enlightening for our times. She was part of the lesser globalization of, let's say, Central and Eastern Europe. We are now part of a broader globalization, but we face the same problems.
Okay, thank you so much. And Anastasiya, just very, very briefly, if you could also answer that question.
Yeah, I think to Irina's point, Deborah Vogel lived at a time, replete with propaganda, at a place that was on the brink of war, hypocrisy of diplomatic relations. And she was very much interested in this interrelationship between fact and fiction, and how that line often gets blurred. And she explored that in her own work. And I think that we need to read Deborah Vogel for the power of that literary expression, for the power of that literary word, to be able to discern that relationship. And I think that's very much what we need today in our time of post-truth and in our time of lack of discernment, where insights from data often replace critical thinking. So I think that she's very much a thinker and a writer for our times, both in Ukraine and globally.
Excellent, thank you so much. So I think we should bring our discussion to a close now. I'd like to thank Anastasiya and Iryna for such a wonderful and enlightening discussion. Thank you so much.